You're at a restaurant on a Tuesday. Laminated dessert menus, a booth that sticks to the back of your arm, a couple to your left, a couple to your right, both ordering the $22 salmon. The couple on your left retired with $1.1 million, the couple on your right retired with 4.9, and the couple on your right is the one who picks up the check, turns it toward the window, and reads it twice. That's not a joke about frugality, that's what the retirement data keeps finding, and it demolishes how you've been taught to think about your number. Because you assume these numbers are floors. 1 million, 2 million, 5 million, each unlocking a bigger version of the life you have. More trips. Nicer car. Same you, upgraded. That is not what happens. My name is Nick, and if you've ever divided your balance by 25 and just stared at the answer, hit subscribe, because today you find out what changes at each of those numbers. And it's never the salmon. Meet the woman on your left, because you'll be doing math with her for 20 minutes. Wendy, 66, $1 million, paid off house, and a 14-year-old Camry 3 people have told her to replace. She keeps it because it runs, which is apparently insane behavior for a millionaire and also exactly what you do. She's the number you've been picturing, and her portfolio isn't her most valuable asset. Then Theo, 2 million, who keeps a spreadsheet with one tab he won't open, and Naomi, 5,062,000 with an attorney's business card on her refrigerator. Hold on to that card. It'll matter more than you think, and it's technically the most expensive thing she owns. Here's the frame to carry because it reorganizes everything. Your number doesn't buy you a lifestyle. It moves you into a different system. At 1 million, you're a Social Security recipient with a nice supplement. Cross into 2 and you stop being a retiree and start being a tax problem, and I mean that with enormous affection. Cross into 5 and you become a legal structure with documents and trustees and a state government that has opinions about your death. Different systems, different opponents, different rules, and the distance between them is not linear. 3 things I'll make you wait for. There's a number where your Social Security stops mattering, and it isn't where you'd guess. There's a reason that couple read the check twice, and there's a price tag on these jumps nobody quotes you, which is the one I'd lose sleep over. First, though, you deserve a reality check about where you're standing right now. The median Fidelity 401k balance in this country is $34,400. Not the average, which is $146,000 and includes people living a very different life than yours. The median. The actual middle. So if you're thinking you're nowhere near $1 million, good, you're normal. You're also exactly who this is for, because your job right now isn't to have the money. It's to find out which of these numbers is worth walking toward before you spend 20 years walking. Nobody tells you that part. They hand you a number and wish you luck. And they're far apart. Your first million puts you in the top 12 to 18% of American households. Your second, top 7 to 10. Your fifth, top 2%. Past that, it's less a curve than a wall. The Federal Reserve puts median household net worth at $193,000. The mean is $1.06 million. Every time somebody tells you what the average retiree has, you're handed the wrong number, usually on purpose. Okay, Wendy, at a 4% withdrawal rate, she pulls $40,000 a year. She and her husband also collect Social Security, and the average married couple's benefit runs $3,200 a month. Call it $38,000 a year. Look at that ratio, because it's the most important thing in the video. Her portfolio makes 40. Social Security makes 38. That program does what your portfolio never will, it doesn't run out, and it raises itself every January whether the market cooperates or not. So what's yours worth? An inflation-adjusted annuity replicating a $2,000 monthly benefit costs near $380,000. If you and your spouse both worked, your combined benefit can clear $1 million by itself. Read that again. Wendy thinks she has $1 million. She has closer to 2, and your invisible half is the half that can't crash, which is why you feel poorer than you are. Your largest asset never sends you a statement, it isn't in your app, there's no number to refresh at 11 at night, so your brain flatly refuses to count it. You've watched that payroll line vanish from your check for 30 years and filed it under theft. Congratulations, you own your best asset and you resent it every payday. Now you're good news, and there's an absurd amount of it. At this income, the tax code leaves you alone. If you're married and your taxable income stays under $98,900, you pay nothing on long-term gains, not a reduced rate. Nothing, you sell stock, realize $60,000 of gain, hand the ears a zero. That isn't a loophole you were clever enough to find. That's the printed rate ignored by nearly everyone who qualifies. You also get the senior deduction, $6,000 per person over 65, phasing out above $150,000. At Wendy's number, you get every dollar. At Theo's, you watch it evaporate. At Naomi's, you never see it. Same tax code, same year, 3 completely different countries depending on your balance. Here's what should frighten you here. Sequence of returns risk. If the market drops 30% in your first 3 years, your $40,000 withdrawal isn't 4% anymore. It's 6% of what's left. And every share you sell at the bottom never comes back for the recovery. Retire in 2000 and you catch the dot-com crash and the financial crisis inside 9 years, which is less a rough patch than a practical joke. Congratulations, you timed it perfectly. In the wrong direction. At $1 million, that isn't something you complain about at dinner. That's your plan ending while you're still healthy enough to watch it happen. Naomi, with $5 million, would call the same crash a bad year. Same market, same week, 2 completely different emotions. Which brings us to a fight nobody told you was happening over your money. You've heard the 4% rule your entire adult life. Here's what they leave out. The man who invented it has spent 30 years quietly walking it back. Bengen ran the study in 1994. His real number was 4.15%, and everyone rounded it down for you. He raised it to 4.5%, then to 4.7%. He now calls that your worst case floor, says 5 to 5.5 is fine in normal conditions, and notes the historical average was closer to 7. Meanwhile, Morningstar runs its own analysis every year, forward-looking instead of historical, and landed on 3.9. So the 2 most cited authorities on the question your retirement rests on are a full point apart. On your million, that's $39,000 a year versus 47. A 20% raise decided by whose spreadsheet you trust. They aren't arguing about facts, they're arguing about method. Both defensible, which is a deeply annoying thing to hear when you're deciding whether you can quit in March. And this is where I remind you I'm not a financial advisor and none of this is advice. I'm a guy who reads too many footnotes and finds other people's disagreements entertaining. Now go see Theo. $2 million, and the first thing that changes is what you'd expect, you spend more. $80,000 at 4% plus that same $38,000 from Social Security. Congratulations, you doubled your money and bought yourself a slightly better grocery store, but watch what happened to the proportions while you weren't looking. At Wendy's number, Social Security was half of everything. At yours, it's a third. Same program, same check, and its grip on your life loosened by a third without you lifting a finger. Here's the part nobody warns you about. You just cross the line where the tax code stops ignoring you and starts negotiating. That 0% capital gains bracket you were living inside, your income now sails past $98,900, so it's gone. Your senior deduction, phasing out exactly as promised. And then there's the one appointment you can't reschedule, required minimum distributions. At 73, the government makes you withdraw from your traditional accounts whether you want the money or not. At 75, your $2 million IRA forces out $81,300. Ordinary income. You don't get to say no. You don't get to say you're fine this year. The ears waited 3 decades for its cut and would very much like to be paid now. And it stacks. It drags more of your Social Security into the taxable column because those thresholds, 25,000 single, 32,000 married, were written in the 80s and never adjusted for inflation. Apparently, indexing them slipped somebody's mind for 4 decades. You're over that line and you have no idea you're standing on it. Then there's IRMA, which is the quietest, meanest thing in the entire American retirement system. IRMA surcharges your Medicare premiums based on your income from 2 years ago. Not a slope, a cliff. $1 over your threshold triggers the whole next bracket for the year. Your surcharges run from $1,100 to nearly $7,000 per person. One extra dollar of income, $1,000 of premium. That isn't a tax. That's a toll booth appearing in your rearview mirror 24 months after you drove through it, and you can't argue. Because technically it's your own fault for having a good year. So what genuinely improves for you here? Sequence risk stops being fatal. Spending 80 from 2 million and the market falls apart, you cut to 65 and ride it out. When Wendy cuts from 40 to 25, that's a different life. When you cut from 80 to 65, that's a different vacation. Your long-term care math shifts too. A private nursing home room runs $129,000 a year, and 70% of you turning 65 will need some form of care. 3 years of it eats 40% of everything Wendy owns. It hurts you badly at Theo's number. At Naomi's, it barely registers. Now, before Naomi, I owe you the reason that couple read the check twice. The Employee Benefit Research Institute tracked retirees for decades. A third of them, 20 years in, still held everything they started with or more. Not people who got lucky, people like you who did everything you were told and never figured out how to stop. Not most of it, more than all of it. They died richer than the day they stopped working, which is technically a win for the portfolio and a fairly grim one for the person. If you retire with $500,000 or more, your median spend down across 20 years is 11.8%. If you'd started with under $200,000, you'd have spent 25%. Sit inside that inversion, because it's the whole video. The people with the least spent the largest share of it. The people with the most spent the smallest. The better you do, the tighter you hold. Wendy holds tighter than you'd expect, Theo tighter than Wendy, Naomi tightest of all, and each would tell you with total confidence they're being sensible. So would you. That's your trap. It never feels like fear. It feels like discipline. J.P. Morgan finds that 2/3 of households following the 4% rule finish 30 years with the same amount or more than they started with. And Blanchett and Fink found that your typical 65-year-old couple actually withdraws 2.1% a year, not 4. 2. So that whole fight you just watched, arguing over your future, you'll never get within shouting distance of it. 2 economists dueling over whether you can safely spend 4% while nobody in the audience spends 3. It's like watching people argue about the speed limit in a parking lot. You won't run out of money, you'll run out of permission to enjoy it. That's your couple on the right, that's your check, turn toward the window, read twice. And it might be yours in 30 years. If that's landing close to home, come tell me in our school community. I want to know where your number came from. I'd bet you inherited it from a headline you half read in a waiting room and have organized your life around it ever since. Good luck finding the article. All right, Naomi, 5 million. Sit in her chair for this part. Because you've been told what it feels like and you've been told wrong. Most of what changes here isn't upside, it's obligation. You pull $200,000 a year at 4%, and your Social Security is now 16% of your income. Which brings me to the number I made you wait for, and I need to correct something you've been told. People say Social Security stops mattering around 3 million. Run it yourself. At 3 million, you're pulling 120,000, and Social Security is still 24% of your income. A quarter of everything. The point where it actually drops below 15% of what you live on is $5,400,000. Which means at $5 million, you aren't past it either. The program that was half of Wendy's life is still a sixth of yours, and that check is doing more work in your retirement than you will ever give it credit for. Now watch the machinery close in on you. At 75, your $5 million IRA forces out $203,000. You don't need it. You didn't ask for it. It arrives anyway, ordinary income, guaranteeing you top bracket exposure. There's a 3.8% surtax starting at $250,000, never indexed either, because apparently nobody in Washington owns a calculator. Welcome to the point where inflation does the legislating. and the Roth conversion that works beautifully at Wendy's number. Converting cheaply before your distributions start inverts on you here. You're already in high brackets. Converting just triggers more IRMA and more surtax. The move that's a no-brainer at your first million is counterproductive at your fifth, which is why generic advice fails you harder the better you do. Good luck finding a video that mentions that. Now go look at her refrigerator, because that card is about to become yours. It belongs to an estate attorney. Here's why it's there. The federal estate tax exemption sits at $15 million per person, $30 million per couple, made permanent. So you owe zero federal estate tax, and every headline you read tells you you're fine. Except 12 states run their own estate taxes, and they did not get that memo. Retire in Oregon, and yours starts at $1 million, Massachusetts, $2 million, Illinois, $4 million, and in New York, exceeding your exemption by 5% exposes your entire estate, which is less a tax policy than a bear trap with a state seal on it. So you, comfortably below the federal line, can owe a six-figure state estate tax bill purely because of which side of a border you retired on. Your children pay it, you won't be there to explain. And Theo, back at $2 million, is already inside that trap in Oregon and Massachusetts. He doesn't know, his spreadsheet has a tab for it, he doesn't open that tab. You have a tab like that too, and you know exactly what it's called. That's where you stop being a person with a portfolio and start being a person who needs a trust, an attorney, and a domicile strategy. Welcome to the point where your money needs paperwork in order to die correctly. One more, and this one's personal. Fee drag. A 1% advisory fee on your first million costs you $10,000 a year. On your fifth, the identical fee for identical service costs you $50. 5 times the money for the same 4 phone calls. Technically, that's a percentage. Functionally, it's a subscription to being wealthy, and it renews whether you use it or not. Over 30 years, that 1% eats 30% of your final portfolio, and most of what you lost was compounding you never got to watch. Flat fee advisors exist. 4,000 flat on your million is 0.4%. On your 5 million, 0.08. At that number 1% is close to indefensible. And the people charging you would prefer you never ran that arithmetic in front of them. Which brings me to the price tag I promised you, and it's the one that actually matters. Nobody ever quotes you the cost of the jump. They only quote you the destination, which is the oldest trick in the brochure. So here it is. Saving $30,000 a year at 7%. Getting from your first million to your second takes you 8 years. Getting from your second to your fifth takes 12 more. 20 years end to end to move from Wendy's life to Naomi's. 20 years. That's the actual price, not dollars. Years, and they're the good ones, the ones where your knees still work and your friends still answer the phone. Nobody quotes you that number because nobody can invoice you for it. And you know how those years get spent. A third of retirees die holding everything they started with. Blanchett finds your real spending declines 1 to 2% a year, bottoming out 26% below where you started around 84. You slow down. Everybody slows down. Your fifth million does not buy your knees back. So your honest question isn't whether 5 million beats 1. Obviously it does. Your question is whether your 20 years cost less than what they bought you. Only you can answer it, because they're your 20 years and nobody is coming to spend them for you. Here's what your 20 years actually buy you, and I want to be fair here, because it's real. Optionality, which is a genuinely terrible word for something you'd pay 2 decades for. At your first million, 1 bad decade ends your plan. At 2, it's a smaller boat and a rough few years. At 5, it's one uncomfortable conversation you then stop thinking about. You're not buying a better life. You're buying immunity from the disasters that would otherwise rearrange the life you already have. That's worth something, just something very different from what your number implies. And there's a ceiling on what it buys you. That famous finding about happiness plateauing at 75,000 got revisited by the original researchers, and their answer was messier than either camp wanted. Your happiness does keep climbing with income. But the increases shrink, and if you're in the least happy fifth, you stop improving near 100,000 because whatever's making you unhappy was never a budgeting problem. Your money keeps working on you. It just works less and less per dollar, which is the most expensive sentence in this video. One last thing, and write this on your wall. $1 million in 2000 had the purchasing power 1.87 million has today. Flip it, your million now buys what 535,000 bought then. Your number didn't move. The world moved underneath it. You didn't get poorer exactly, your million did. So let's put you back at that restaurant. Wendy's on your left, holding the best asset in the room and not counting it. Theo's across town with a tab he won't open. Naomi's on your right reading her check twice, not because she can't afford it, but because nobody taught her how to stop climbing. And you're at the table in the middle, which is the only seat in the restaurant that still has options. Because that third of retirees who die with everything didn't fail at math. They succeeded at accumulating and never learned the other half. Nobody teaches you how to stop. The entire industry is built to help you climb, then goes silent the moment you arrive. So the question I'd leave you with isn't what's my number, it's this. If you woke up at your number tomorrow, what would you actually do differently on Wednesday? If the answer is nothing, find that out now while you still have the 20 years to spend on something else. And if it's something specific, something you can picture, then you know what you're climbing toward and the number is just logistics. Everything here is observation and arithmetic, not advice, and every figure has a date on it. Verify anything you plan to act on. So go find your Wednesday.